This is part 2 of every place mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapters 10 through 16, and if you ever get lost when you encounter places like Jericho, Bethpage, we got you covered.
Let's go.
Mark 10, verse 1. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. So we're getting close to kind of the climactic moment of the story, and we're entering into the outskirts of the city. So think about those suburbs around whatever major city you live close to. Jesus is kind of entering into that region, and he's going to spend some time in a couple of places around Jerusalem proper before kind of the big event happens.
So he's in Judea, and he crosses the Jordan. Now, we began the book of Mark where Jesus crosses the Jordan to go be baptized by John the Baptist. And now he's crossing the Jordan River again, and he's heading to Jerusalem.
And if you want to download a copy of this slideshow, you can get it for free in our video description below.
Mark 10:32 through 33 say this: They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. Something I notice here is they say on their way up to Jerusalem. Up to Jerusalem. And yet we know in the northern part of Israel, Galilee has all these mountains, and the elevation is actually much higher than Jerusalem. So what could they mean by going up to Jerusalem? Well, Jerusalem itself is on a mountain. It's actually not as high as the Mount of Olives near it, but it's still on a mountain. Jerusalem is on this mountain that you can look out, you can climb, and this is where the temple is. It's a place dedicated to God. And ironically, where the story of Israel, there's lots of high places in the story of Israel, but they're high places, tops of mountains, hills, where false worship happens to idols. And here, God said, this is the place where I want to encounter you. And in many ways, it mirrors the mountain that is Eden, where it's there's a garden. It's kind of like a temple. And then in the middle of that garden is the tree of life, the Holy of Holies. And here we have, a wall, a temple, and an inner Holy of Holies where you can encounter God's presence. And yet the irony is that Jesus is the very temple of God. Jesus is the most holy place. And he's on his way up to Jerusalem. So he's bringing the presence of God to this mount.
Yeah, and we've mentioned this before. The way Mark structures the story, it almost sounds as if this is his first time going to Jerusalem. But we know from the other narratives that Jesus would have been to Jerusalem a number of times, probably multiple times a year, to go celebrate the different pilgrimage festivals that required Jews to go to the temple for worship. And actually, as Jewish people would go to Jerusalem, they had certain songs that they would sing. And we have some of them in the book of Psalms. And they're called Psalms of Ascent because they were sung as they were going up to Jerusalem. And so Jesus might have been singing some of those psalms as they were making their way there. Mark 10:46 and 47. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me."
If you're familiar with the Old Testament or VeggieTales, you know that Jericho, or just pop culture in general when it comes to the Bible, Jericho's the city that the people of Israel walked around and then the walls came tumbling down.
A couple quick clarifications. There are likely two Jerichos. So there's the original Jericho that the Israelites walked around and the walls came tumbling down, that was destroyed. People think it's this location here. It's all way smarter than me, and you can go check that out. You can Google it, YouTube it. Then there's also a Herodian Jericho 2 miles away that is more modern. Now, did Jesus walk through the original Jericho or the Herodian Jericho? Did Jesus walk through both of them? We're not exactly sure. There's a lot of interesting theories out there, but now you can go do your own research if you're interested to learn more.
So here's another way to think about it, kind of a modern example. Have you ever heard of the Salem witch trials? Well, that's something that happened in Massachusetts in history. And actually today you can go to the town of Salem and they call themselves Witch City. You can even go to the Witch Trials Museum. But the Salem witch trials took place in an area much bigger than Salem that included things like modern-day Essex and modern-day Danvers, Massachusetts. So there was this greater Salem area during the time of the witch trials, but today there's still a Salem, Massachusetts that claims the same name and history. Kind of the same thing. There was a historical ancient Jericho, and then there was the Jericho at the time of Christ. Slightly different, same name, lots of combined history.
What you might not know is that Joshua laid a curse on Jericho when God destroyed it that first time. Joshua 6:26 says this, "At that time Joshua pronounced this solemn oath, 'Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates.'" We actually find out that this curse is fulfilled in 1 Kings 16:34. In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. It's interesting that Jesus is now passing through Jericho to become a curse, right? That he is the son who is going to lay down his life in order to redeem cities like Jericho.
Another interesting thing about the Old Testament story of Jericho is, again, we have a story with Joshua and Jesus, same name, and Jericho is this Canaanite city, so not Jewish. And how were they able to take the city? Well, they had sent in spies who were aided by Rahab, and they make this deal, and they say, "We will protect you. God won't destroy you when the city is destroyed." And so sure enough, Rahab, because she kind of proves her faithfulness to Yahweh over and above her own government and the people coming looking for the spies, she and her family are spared, even though her house was in the wall of the city, because she lets the men down out of her window, out of the wall. And then she becomes an Israelite and is grafted into the community of Israel and becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus. And so it's this really redemptive story of Gentiles having the opportunity to turn to Yahweh and someone taking God up on his offer. And so that's, again, what Jesus is doing. He's going to the cross in order to open wide the gates to the Gentiles to receive salvation. I also think it's interesting that they recognize that it's Jesus of Nazareth. Again, we think of the name Jesus as being pretty unique, at least in the English language. You don't meet a lot of Jesuses. In other cultures, you might meet people with that name. But here, it's kind of acknowledging that it's not just Jesus, it's Jesus of Nazareth, or sometimes they'll call him Jesus, the son of Joseph. And they're also designating that it's Jesus of Nazareth, but then the blind man calls out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And so again, that's got a little bit of an eye towards Jerusalem, because as we're going to see, David and Jerusalem's stories are really interlinked.
Mark 11:1, "As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples." They've left Jericho, they're getting closer to Jerusalem, and they pass by these three places, Bethphage and Bethany and the Mount of Olives. So the Mount of Olives is just east of Jerusalem. Like, you can see it from the different maps how close it is, but you could actually see it from Jerusalem. These are these two small villages near the Mount of Olives. So Bethany was also the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. And that's not recorded in Mark, but it is in John chapter 11. Jesus prepared his triumphal entry from here.
In Mark, it talks about Jesus being anointed at the house of Simon the leper, also in Bethany. And from parallel accounts, it seems that might have been Mary, the sister of Martha, who did that. Okay, so we come to the Mount of Olives, and this is a location that has a couple of key moments in the Old Testament where it's mentioned. So one of them is in the story of King David. When he's running away from his son Absalom, he goes to the Mount of Olives, and then David's son Solomon actually chooses this as a place to build some idolatrous worship sites, so not great. And then this gets mentioned again in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel has this really beautiful vision of the glory of God. It's tragic in some ways because God's glory leaves the temple. Ezekiel was a prophet during the time of the Babylonian exile, and it talks about how, it's not that God wasn't strong enough to fight the gods of Babylon. It's that God abandoned his city to allow them to be taken over and destroyed. And so Ezekiel has this vision of God's very presence leaving the temple and resting for a time on the Mount of Olives, and then ultimately going and being with the people in Babylon. But the Mount of Olives is kind of this little stopover place. And then probably the biggest one is in the book of Zechariah. So Zechariah is a post-exilic prophet, and he has a lot of key images that point forward to Jesus. So he's the one who says, here comes your king riding on a donkey. That's from Zechariah. Another passage is where it talks about the Lord standing on the Mount of Olives. And it's this apocalyptic text. And it says from Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 through 5. On that day, the Lord shall stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley. And so Jesus would have been so familiar with these texts, and so his desire to go there and spend time there, this last part of his life, was intentional. And there's debate when it comes to end times things, whether or not this prophecy was fulfilled by Christ before the Passion, or if this is something that we're still waiting for because the mount wasn't literally split into a valley. But there's no doubt that this was a significant place in Jesus's mind, and it wasn't just because he liked eating olives that he ended up there during this time.
And that's how it got its name. There was just a lot of olive trees there. So that was the place to go if you wanted to taste some olives.
Maybe he did like olives too. But
maybe he did like olives. And Jesus might have taken the road that ran through there, right, all the way from Jericho to the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. Here's an older photograph showing the city.
Mark 11 through 12. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry.
Here's a zoomed-in map of this area. Jesus is now at Jerusalem. Today, the Dome of the Rock sits at the site of the temple, and there's certainly some international conflict, religious conflict over that. Islam considers this a holy place, and so do the Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
And some Christians think that we need to rebuild a temple here on this site in order for Jesus to return. And while we don't have time to go into that right now, Jesus is the temple and his church is the temple. And so I don't think we need an additional temple beyond that. Historic photo, Mark 11:15a. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. And Mark 11:27. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. So in the last 5 chapters of the book of Mark, we hear a lot about this temple. It was a place where the people gathered for religious observance, for social community. It was like religious, social, and economic, right? Mm-hmm. This was kind of like our Wall Street combined with our biggest, most successful churches combined with the capital, right? Like all of these things came to play in this area. And so when the religious leaders felt threatened by Jesus, that his teachings were going against what helped everything stay established, like they would have seen him as a real threat to their systems and their powers. And so that's one of the reasons he ended up being crucified.
Yeah, Jerusalem being the capital city is something that was inaugurated by King David. He's the one that made Jerusalem the capital. We know a little bit about Jerusalem before that. We know that the Jebusites inhabited it going way back. Salem comes from the same root word as like shalom or salam. It means peace. And all the way back in Genesis, we encountered this king who is the high priest and king of Salem, Melchizedek. And he's kind of this curious figure who prefigures Christ. And so then David makes Jerusalem his capital, and he wants to build a temple for God because God was dwelling in a tabernacle until this point. And there's this amazing passage in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David says, I'm going to build a house for God. And the prophet Nathan at first says, great idea. And then he hears from God, and God's like, not a great idea. And so Nathan has to go back and say, actually, David, you want to build a house for God, but God says he's going to build you a house, meaning a dynasty. And he gives these covenant promises, one of which being that a son of David will sit on an eternal throne. And so Jesus is the fulfillment of that covenant promise. And it's actually David's son Solomon who builds the first temple there in Jerusalem. That's the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians, the one in Ezekiel's vision. And the temple is not in existence for a while. And then they come back with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, same name as Jesus, they build a second temple. And so in this period it's called Second Temple Judaism. And so the temple that Jesus was walking around is not the same as Solomon's temple. And it's not exactly the same as Zerubbabel's temple, because Herod the Great did kind of a big renovation project. Even though he wasn't Jewish himself, he wanted to kind of appease his Jewish contingency there. And so it was supposedly just an incredible piece of architecture. And we have non-biblical authors talk about it at the time as kind of this amazing wonder, a sight to see, Herod's temple. And so that's the temple that Jesus is walking around and encountering in Mark.
I like this picture of the model of Jerusalem. It helps you visualize what it might have looked like.
And we talk about the temple and the difference between a temple and a synagogue in one of our videos that we'll link. One of the major things about the temple was this is where sacrifices were offered. And it was the only place where sacrifices were offered. So if you were an observant Jew during this time, you couldn't just go out in your backyard and slaughter a sheep and call it good. You actually had to go to Jerusalem to engage in this religious practice. And that's part of why there were money changers in the temple, because you didn't necessarily want to bring your sheep down from wherever you were from, so you would sell your sheep and go down there and then buy a sheep to sacrifice. It was a whole thing. But so this practice of animal sacrifice was something that was really, really important to the Jewish faith at this time. And after Jesus died on the cross, Christians, we no longer offer animal sacrifice because we believe that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. But the temple was still around for another 35 years after Jesus died, and that practice of the sacrificial system was ongoing. And so the book of Hebrews, for example, was likely written before the temple was destroyed, because it spends so much time showing that Jesus is this greater sacrifice, because it's writing to people who were likely still wondering if they should offer animal sacrifice, because the temple was still there. The temple was there in Jerusalem until 70 AD, when the Romans finally came in and destroyed it, and there hasn't been a Jewish temple there since. And so a lot of modern day Judaism has had to, through the rabbis and their scribes and understanding their faith, kind of rewrite, what do we do with this idea of sacrifice? What does sacrifice mean if we don't have a temple and we can't offer the sacrifices there? Whereas again, as Christians, Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And so temple or not, we're not doing that. Although I do love a good barbecue.
When I would preach through that passage where Jesus chases out the money changers, the money lenders, I would kind of paint this picture of Jesus chasing out the animals and the money changers, and the pilgrims came to Jerusalem in order to sacrifice an animal. Many of them would not bring their lambs. They would come and they would purchase a lamb. And so if there's no access, there's only maybe one lamb left standing in the temple, and that's Jesus, who is the perfect sacrifice who takes away the sins of the world. And I like that picture. It's and how it points to Christ.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll say a lot more of that when we get to that chapter in Mark.
That's right.
We'll have to come back to hear more, because there's a lot to be said there.
Mark 13:13. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. Here's another picture of the Mount of Olives, an aerial view, and you just really get a sense of the layout of the city and the mountain, Bethpage, Bethany, not too far away. I wanted to show a map of what it's like over the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives today. So you can just get a sense of the Mount of Olives to the right, Dome of the Rock to the left, and the space in between, and what that looks like here with the aerial view. And Acts 1 tells us that this is actually, the Mount of Olives is the last place that the disciples encountered Jesus, that once he ascended into heaven, 2 angels appeared to them, and then they returned. Acts 1:12 says, "Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city." So it's interesting that, earlier there's this vision of the glory cloud departing Jerusalem over the Mount of Olives. And here Jesus departs us, this world, his people, over the Mount of Olives. And so we, in some sense, have to walk by faith, just like those people in exile, waiting our Savior's return. So let's keep the faith.
Mark 13:14. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains.
Here Jesus is talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, and that it's better to flee to the mountains. And there is this kind of apocalyptic theme throughout the entire Bible, talking about mountains and judgment, and that could be a place of not necessarily safety, but it was a place people went to for safety, and yet we know the only safe place at judgment is with Christ. It's by putting your faith and trust in him. Mark 14:3. While he was in Bethany reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. So these are the ruins of Simon the leper's home, or what we think, what someone has come up with and says, here's the ruins. And that's really interesting, because if Simon, this person, was a leper, he would have been an outcast from society. Lepers were not allowed to come in and be a part of the community because it was contagious, because they were considered unclean. And so Simon had to then become clean. Right? People would have taken notice, like, this is the home of someone who was deathly sick and was made well. And we don't know for sure, but perhaps it was Jesus who healed this man, and then he brought him in, and he would have stayed there, right, when he went to Jerusalem.
Mark 14:13. So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him." Mark 14:26 and 28. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. "But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee."
So we know from other gospel accounts that Jesus went then into the upper room and celebrated the Last Supper. And here's a picture of what some people think might be the upper room in Jerusalem, which I'm not sure exactly how they would be able to figure that out because of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And then he was at the Mount of Olives, and is promising then to return back to Galilee of the Gentiles. So when Jesus returns to Galilee, we don't really hear about that in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus encounters Peter, and he restores him after Peter's denial. But I do think it's interesting that Jesus returns to, Galilee of the Gentiles, right? That the mission began in Galilee, and it's going to kind of go to Jerusalem, make that sacrifice, but it's never meant to just stay in Jerusalem. And that's a reminder to us as we follow the leading of Jesus, that we go out and we spread the good news to the places that he calls us to go. Mark 14:32, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." So there's a couple different sites that might be Gethsemane, but we actually do not know where Gethsemane is. There's some gardens that we think, maybe this is where Jesus was. And I do like the pictures of this older one, this more traditional site here. There's some olive trees in there, and it's pretty.
Yeah, Gethsemane means oil press, which makes sense to be near a grove of olives, olive oil. And yeah, we know that the Garden of Gethsemane is where Jesus is brought to real depth of emotion and kind of psychological torment, really, as he prepares to endure the cross.
Yeah, we get the sense that Jesus didn't really want to go to the cross, but he was willing to go because of obedience, because of faith in his Father, because of trust, because of love. And yet he had a good sense of what lay ahead. And didn't want to enter into that suffering.
Yeah, Jesus has a pattern of going to a quiet place or going to a solitary place, getting away from the crowds. And so here, even though he's bringing his disciples with him, he still kind of goes a little further on his own to spend that time with his Father. And in this case, it's in a garden.
Jesus is arrested, and then he is taken to the courtyard of the high priest. Mark 14:54 says this: Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire.
Mark 14:66 through 67. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said.
So there's a couple different theories of where this might have taken place. I've circled both on this map. The first place, the Antonia Fortress, has long been considered a place where Jesus might have been put on trial. But another more recent idea is that this could have actually happened at the Herodian mansion used by Jerusalem priests. So we can see that's in a different part of Jerusalem. And I can totally see how maybe it could have been either place, right? It could have been more the fortress, maybe the more visible public location. But, this was happening at night, and maybe there was some desire for privacy, and maybe it took place at the high priest's house, the Herodian mansion used by the priests in Jerusalem. And here's some pictures of the foundation, the various passageways that you can actually see on some of these photos. Old tiling, and then some burn marks from the destruction of Jerusalem. So I think it's pretty interesting to think about this space as well.
Yeah, we know from the text that they were not necessarily going by the book the way they should have with a trial of Christ, and so I think having it in a untraditional place is likely.
Well, it also says while Peter was below in the courtyard, so people think, oh, maybe that's a hint that it was actually this home with multiple levels. Here's an old artist depiction of Nazareth from 1842.
Being referenced because Jesus the Nazarene, again, he's being associated with the place that he's from, brings that with him into Jerusalem. After they keep reminding him, you're not from here, you're not really one of us.
There's so many pictures in this slideshow because it just keeps on saying Nazareth. Jesus is unable to carry his cross because he's been scourged, he's been abused, he's in terrible shape, in a lot of pain, incredibly weak. And so in Mark 15:21 we see this: a certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. And I think this is interesting because just the name, right? Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, clearly these people were known by the early church, right? There's a clue there that maybe Simon, this man who carried the cross, became a Christian, or at least Alexander and Rufus became followers of Jesus.
Yeah, so in the book of Romans, Paul says to greet someone named Rufus. And so we don't know for a fact that it's the same Rufus. Rufus is not necessarily as popular a name as Simon in these times. Or
Joshua.
Or Joshua, Jesus. And so some scholars have speculated that maybe Mark was writing to a Roman audience based on that connection. And yeah, there would have been Jewish people from all over in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And likewise, that's why there's people from all over when the Holy Spirit descends at Pentecost. Those were the festivals that you would pilgrimage for. And so would have been a lot of people from all over the Roman Empire coming to Jerusalem to worship.
Cyrene is from northern Africa. And here's a picture of some ruins, some cultic worship sites there. Mark 15:22 says this: they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they led him out to crucify him. So I've marked on this map a couple different locations where we think these events might have happened. To the west of the temple court, you see a blue dot. You see Golgotha and Christ's tomb. This is the more traditional site. There is a church there called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that Constantine's mother, Helena, actually identified this as the place of Jesus's death and his resurrection, right? Because they're not far from each other. They're like, the idea was like this was a site for executions, and they had the burial place, the tombs, right by it. And I think, the place of the skull, Golgotha, like we don't know what that means. Is it a place that looks like a skull, or is it just simply a place where executions took place, right? Like we think of skulls as kind of morbid, symbolizing death. To the north, we have another location that's a little bit more recent and yet less evidence for the cross and tomb being there.
Yeah, the skull, I've heard that it might be a reference to David and Goliath, because, right, David cuts Goliath's head off, and then there's some parallels there. Yeah.
Here's some pictures of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the site that's been venerated and a place that pilgrims go. And so, when I would always imagine like Golgotha, a place of the skull, I didn't imagine just like a church, right? But it's a whole religious site now where people come, and you actually have this altar of the crucifixion where perhaps they think Jesus was crucified. And I like this cutout map because it gives us a clearer picture of like, okay, so what would this have looked like a long time ago, right? There would have been perhaps a mountain, a tomb, a place that was a rock, that was a place of execution. I'll put a link in this video description about, is this the place? It's a really well done video. It has over 1 million views. Another option that people think, well, maybe Jesus was crucified there is Gordon's Calvary. So this is a much more recent proposition. It only dates back to the 19th century because this place looks kind of like a skull, but most scholars think, well, it wouldn't have looked exactly like this during the time of Jesus. And so it's likely not the place of crucifixion. You can see some older pictures of it as well. And there's a tomb near here as well, but perhaps it wouldn't have dated to this time.
Mark 15:41-43. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body.
So we're again reminded of Galilee. Here's a picture of the Sea of Galilee from space, just to mix that in, and then the region of Jerusalem. And you can zoom in and see what the region looks like also from space. And then we get a picture of Ramah that is thought to be Arimathea. So that's not all that far, actually, from Jerusalem. Joseph of Arimathea. Mark 15:46. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. So I want to go back and look at those two places again, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb. So if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you'll encounter the tomb of Jesus Christ, the shrine that has been built over it. And it's like this box inside the church where people line up to go and see. There's a couple other pictures, a couple different angles to give us an idea of what it's like. Maybe one day you'll get to visit and go see it in person. But it's pretty significant, right? If Jesus rose from the grave here, well, then we all have hope. I think he did rise from the grave. I don't know if it was here. You can see inside. And honestly, there wasn't a lot of great photos just because I think it's a very busy space and darkly lit. And maybe they don't want you taking a lot of photos there. And then here's the other potential garden tomb location, which is a little bit to the north of the walls of Jerusalem. But they've done some studies and they think this actually dates later than the time that Jesus would have died and rose again.
Yeah, that's interesting to visit these places or to study these locations, whether or not they are the actual latitude and longitude of where the event happened. We can still learn a lot about Christianity and church history and how Christians have engaged with this real thing that happened in a time and in a place, and how different people over time have tried to signify that and represent that in things like shrines and churches and things like that. So it's not that by going there you receive any kind of magical properties or anything like that, but it is an opportunity to recognize that throughout the last 2,000 years, real people have based their life on this real event having happened and have wanted to commemorate that.
And you can get a sense of what it was like just by looking at some of these older pictures, even if they didn't perhaps date to the exact time of Jesus. Mark 16, 6 through 7 say this. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And I love that the Gospel of Mark goes right back to Nazareth. And here's a picture of Nazareth today, and then Galilee today. And it's just a reminder that Jesus is on the move in the places we least expect. If you liked this presentation, please download a copy. We've put a link in our video description and would love for you to share it with your friends. Send them a link to this video. Please drop a comment, subscribe to this video.
And join us as we go through the rest of the Gospel of Mark.
And thanks to all of these different sources, loads and loads of different sources of people that took pictures and these maps, Baker Encyclopedia and other Bible encyclopedias that were really a great help to me. God bless.